Well, hi, I'm Evie Rosen. My mother and father were Ann and Sam Cohen, and they met here in Wausau. My father was a dentist in town, and my mother had gone to college, got a degree, and was hired by General Mills as one of the first 5 Betty Crockers that went around demonstrating all the products of General Mills in various communities. And when she was here in Wausau doing demonstration, that's where she met my father. I was an only child. I was born June 14th, 1926, and I grew up here in Wausau and went to Wausau schools. In high school, I was editor-in-chief of the Skyrocket. I was on the student council. I went to Badger Girls State. That's a program down in Madison that teaches young men and young women about government. And so I was always interested in that kind of thing. I graduated in 1943 and went on to Madison to go to school. But when I was growing up, I lived in the apartment building in Wausau here. It still exists. It's across from Sturgeon Bluff. There's a clump of little apartments right on the corner of Sturgeon Eddy and Grand Avenue, and that's where I grew up. Went down to Madison, like I said, after graduating from high school, and got a degree as an occupational therapist. Now, my roommate from college got married, and at her wedding, I met a man by the name of Evie Rosen. He was one of the ushers at the wedding. And so we corresponded, and after a time, we got married. He was from Atlanta, Georgia, so when we were first married, we moved to Atlanta. We're there for about 6 years, maybe 7. You know, when you get older, you just sort of forget some of these things. But we had 2 children, Michael and Robin. And after, like I said, 6 or 7 years, we had an opportunity to come back to Wausau, so we did. Once the children were in school at Mount Sinai, where I had met Joy Levine, who also was a knitter, and I didn't, realize she was a knitter until we talked about hobbies and got to know one another. I had been a knitter for years and years. I'd started knitting when I was 7, and that was one of my main things to relax and just as a hobby to do. So we got known as experts in knitting, and we're getting all kinds of questions from people, friends, and friends would refer friends over to us to figure out patterns or come up with a new design or something like that. So like I said, when our children were in school, Joy and I decided we'd like to start a knitting shop. And this was in 1964. So we went to First American Bank in downtown Wausau and talked with one of the bank officers, Mr. Myers, in order to get a loan. There weren't really many organizations at that time that would support women in business. There were a lot of men's organizations and old boys clubs, so to speak, but nothing for women. So our main supporters initially were our families. And of course, what also helped us was customers. We had our first little shop over on Broadway in a garage. The garage is still there. It's behind the Dairy Queen. It didn't have any heat, didn't have any running water, and it didn't have bathrooms. So when we needed to use the facilities, we'd go to the shoe store, which is what the shop on the corner was at that time, if we needed to. And we were there for about 2 years. Initially, when we started the shop, a lot of people would buy yarn on layaway. They'd come in, we'd select a pattern, and then I'd set aside enough yarn for the project. And I don't know if for those of you who aren't knitters, you want yarn all to be from the same dye batch, because it can be called the same color, but if it's not from the same dye patch, sometimes if it would be next to one another, you'd notice a difference in tone of color. So that's why people wanted all of their yarn at once, but couldn't necessarily afford it. So we did quite a big business in layaway. there was a little mall that was being built right across from what's now the Eagle's Nest. It's also on Grand Avenue, not too far from the Broadway shop. And we were one of the first tenants in that little mall. Our store was always called the Knitting Nook. After we moved into that store, Joy had been ill for a time and really couldn't continue on to help with the business, so I bought her out. I continued on with making patterns and writing patterns. Patterns were for Leisure Arts and some of the other knitting magazines and different knitting companies. And I would go to market and got to know more knitters. And as we would network, we got more and more support for our business. So I helped to encourage people to become certified as teachers. I believe that was with the Yarn Council of America. And so nowadays there really are a lot of organizations and a lot of support out there for people who want to do what Joy and I did way back in the 1960s. Sometimes people would bring back their finished projects for me to look at, and I got together with people from the AAUW, the American Association of University Women, and we would have a little fashion show every year, and it was a little fundraiser for the AAUW, and it gave people an opportunity to show interest in knitting and get other people interested in knitting, and it was always held down at the Wausau Country Club. Another thing that I did was started a project that today is known as Warm Up America, and that started in the early 1990s. There was a lot of information that we were reading about and hearing about on television about all the homeless people in the United States, and they didn't have, blankets or hats to keep their head warm and things like that. And I had been having customers coming in with leftover yarn saying, did I know anybody that could use it? Was there a place they could send it to? They didn't want to throw out the yarn because it was still good. And I thought, well, maybe we could start knitting some squares or crocheting squares and put them together into Afghans for the homeless. So we started out here in Wausau doing that. And even people sometimes that weren't knitters would come into the shop and would sit down. They knew how to sew, and they would help sew the squares together. And we started locally, giving to some of the local homeless shelters and the Salvation Army. And then it got to be more like Warm Up Wisconsin. And then the Knitting Council got involved, and it got way too big for me by myself to handle. So it's now a not-for-profit organization. And as of last year, I believe it is, they even started a Warm Up Canada project. So people will knit squares, put them into Afghans. They'll also knit hats and then give them to various shelters through the organization Warm Up America. My picture was in Time magazine, which was pretty exciting, and I got recognized by Oprah Winfrey and by Vanna White and various other celebrities that knit. I'm quite proud of that. I also am proud of the fact that I helped to establish some of the early Wausau women's business group to support women in business in this area. I did work for a little while as an occupational therapist. That didn't really go to waste. I worked at the TB sanitarium here in town. It was out in the country. Did that for a little while, but once the shop started and I did that, that's pretty much how I spent my time. I became ill and had a lung removed, and then I died in 2012. So that's my story.